Good day. Today, 22nd December 2023, we've got more news from the battlefronts of Ukraine, none of which seems to me to change the overall picture. We still see Ukraine gradually retreating, not by vast distances, but perhaps at heavy cost, as the Russians push forward on every part of the front line. Now, yesterday, there were reports that the Ukrainians have withdrawn completely from the village of Stepovoye, northwest of Avdiivka. I have to say, I've heard reports of that sort of thing happening several times before. There does seem to be a consensus that it has actually happened this time. I noticed that both Redovka, which is this Russian newspaper based in Smolensk, which covers the war in detail, and Julian Röpke, the journalist for Bild Zeitung, who is, of course, a supporter of Ukraine, basically are telling us the same story, that the Ukrainians have indeed withdrawn from Stepovoye. It also, however, seems to be the case that the Russians have not occupied this village. Russian troops do not appear to have entered Stepovoye. They've pushed the Ukrainians out, but they've not marched in and taken possession of it themselves. And the reason is that this remains a fiercely contested area. The Ukrainians have built up defences on the eastern outskirts of Stepovoye. They have not apparently fallen back all the way to Berdichi. It would be very, very costly for the Russians to try to occupy Stepovoye themselves, and for the time being, they're not doing so. But there are also all sorts of other reports of the Russians advancing along the railway line west of Stepovoye. They're advancing northward towards the high ground a little further to the north, and it seems that they're also intent on capturing fields and forest lines to the west of the railway, both north and south of Stepovoye. And I think when one looks at this situation overall, the impression one is getting is that gradually, eventually, the Russians will gain control of this territory. Now, yesterday I said that this is an intense battle of attrition that is taking place for Stepovoye. The Ukrainians are burning up men and machines, reserves, to try to hold on to this village. I said that given the preponderance that the Russians have in this area, sooner or later the attrition would tell, and the Russians would indeed take control of this village. And I suspect we are somewhat closer to that point now, though we've not yet reached it. Anyway, that's the news from Stepovoye. I should say that by general consensus, if Stepovoye and Berdichi are captured by the Russians, the situation of the Ukrainian troops in Avdiivka will become critical. The supply lines to Avdiivka will in effect have been cut, and the wise thing would be in that case for the Ukrainians to beat a hasty withdrawal from Avdiivka, which would result in that particular town finally passing fully under Russian control. Whether they will do that, I don't know. More likely they will do what they always have done. They will try and fight on and stay there, in which case, if the Russians do eventually capture Stepovoye and Berdichi, in that case a cauldron will appear, but we're not yet quite there yet. Anyway, that's Avdiivka. There's also been lots of news from the two other places where the Russians are pushing forward. One is in the Bakhmut area. They seem to be making further advances in the area around the villages of Ivanivska and Bogdanovka. It looks as if the Russians are preparing to storm both of these villages. Ivanivska is the target of a unit which consists principally of ex-Wagner fighters, backed by Chechen fighters. It's apparently the more difficult village to capture. There are lots of wooded areas and forests around it. Of course, now that we're in winter, the foliage will have thinned, so maybe the forest lines are not quite as dense as they would be in the summer. And it seems that the Russians are also making serious attempts to capture Bogdanovka itself. It seems that they have entered this village. They did so some time ago, but for the moment at least, their priority seems to be, again, to gain territory around this village before they actually storm it. And just before I started making this program, there was reports that the Russians are also making further advances in the Marinka area, clearing the outlying areas of that town, which is now essentially under Russian control. But perhaps more importantly, making significant attempts now to capture Novomikhailovka, this village to the south of Marinka, which apparently has some strategic significance related to the battles at Vugleda. And I've even read somewhere that the Russians have, in effect, created some kind of a fire sack around this village, that the Ukrainian troops who are there and their supply lines are now under heavy shelling attack by the Russians, and that the Ukrainians, as a result, are suffering extremely heavy losses. So there we go. That is the general situation on the battlefronts, as far as I can see. Yesterday, there was a major drone attack by the Russians on Kiev. There's some speculation that missiles of some kind were also launched towards Kiev. I'm not able to confirm much of this, but it does seem that there have been heavy explosions in and around Kiev. The Ukrainians, of course, claim that they've shot down most, or indeed perhaps even all, of the drones, the Russian drones, presumably Uranium-2 drones. And for the moment, at least anyway, the situation is unclear. But anyway, there was a major Russian drone strike and bomb strike, a missile strike rather, on Kiev itself, and no doubt other parts of Ukraine also. And the Ukrainians themselves, according to the Russians, according to Saldo, the governor of the Russian-appointed governor of Kherson region, that they also apparently launched one of their own missiles. According to Saldo, this was a ATACMS missile towards the Kerch Bridge, which is interesting because if they did indeed launch an ATACMS missile towards the Kerch Bridge, then based on the range and presumably the need for this missile to have a unitary warhead, it would seem as if the missile that was launched was a more advanced version of the ATACMS than the ones that the Ukrainians were provided previously, which were based on cluster munitions. Now, there's been some talk about whether or not this is really the case, but for the moment, we'll see, and we'll keep waiting. But the fact is that the Russians claim that whatever kind of a missile it was, they managed to shoot it down. Now, on Russian objectives in the war, there's been another statement by another senior Russian official. This is Valentina Matviyenko, who is a member of Russia's Security Council. She's also the Speaker of the Federation Council, which is the higher, the upper house of the Russian Parliament. And Matviyenko again has said that as far as the Russians are concerned, the priority is to achieve all of their original objectives in Ukraine. Demilitarization, denuclearization, denazification, neutral status for Ukraine, all of those things. Until all of those objectives are achieved in full, then the Russians will not call off their military campaign in Ukraine. And this has been the theme that all Russian officials have been uniting around. Putin is saying it, Medvedev is saying it, Lavrov is saying it, Shoigu is saying it, and now we've had Matviyenko also saying it. And as I discussed in my program yesterday, I get the strong sense that no one in the West is seriously considering or capable of considering any sort of negotiation process, whilst the Russians themselves are not interested in entertaining negotiations either. If proposals are placed before them, they will consider them, but unless they fulfill all of their stated objectives, which I suspect are expanding by the day, and I think it's now fairly clear that Ukraine's Black Sea coast, Odessa, for example, remains very much in their sights now. Unless all of those objectives are satisfied, the Russians will not take any proposal seriously. And in my program yesterday, I also discussed the bitter feelings that Putin himself feels, his deep anger, not just with the Western powers, but to a great extent with himself, that he allowed the West to string him along for so long, and given that he has those feelings, I can't seriously imagine that he at least has any real belief that any kind of negotiated solution to this conflict is going to happen. His trust in the West, his belief that there is any chance of a good faith negotiation with the West has been shot to pieces. So there we go. I think that we have to accept the reality that for the next couple of months at least, probably for the whole of next year, the war in Ukraine will continue, with the Russians increasing remorselessly their pressure on Ukraine, and Ukraine, for its part, burning up more and more of its reserves, its manpower base, its economy, all of those things, as it tries to withstand a Russian juggernaut of increasing and overwhelming power. Now, that, of course, leaves the West in something of a quandary. For the moment, at least, there seems to be little prospect of Congress voting funding for Ukraine. There's still arguments about this in the Senate. Speaker Johnson seems to be opposed to the whole idea. I said yesterday that the decision by the Colorado Supreme Court to prohibit Donald Trump from participating in the Republican primaries in Colorado and ultimately in the general election itself is likely to harden feeling amongst some Republicans against doing anything that might facilitate what they would see as Joe Biden's war. So it doesn't look as if funding from the United States is going to come in any great number great quantity. And at the same time, we're getting more and more reports about manpower shortages in Ukraine itself, that the mobilization pool in Ukraine has shrunk, that the attempts to find recruits for the Ukrainian army is proving increasingly difficult, that Zelensky has told Zelensky that he needs another 500,000 men to make up the numbers. Both Zelensky and Zelensky have now publicly said that they do not want women joining the army, which is, I have to say, a relief. It's a disastrous idea, but it seems that the opposition to it within Ukraine was so strong, and I suspect in parts of the army as well, was so strong that that particular idea has been abandoned. But Zelensky wants 500,000 men. Zelensky says that he's prepared to agree to provide these 500,000 men, but where are they to come from? So there is that problem of finding manpower for the Ukrainian army. And the United States and the Europeans are now also in a situation where Congress is unwilling to authorize funds. Funding from Europe is apparently burning out. This 50 billion euro package looks like, when it is eventually passed, as it will be, that it will be the last package of large funding that the European Union provides to Ukraine. And it's important again to reiterate that it is intended over a 4-year basis. There's now critical shortages of equipment across Europe for the European militaries. The European militaries have stripped themselves of whatever weapon systems they had. There's a bleak article about this in Asia Times by Stephen Bryan, by the way, in which he discusses the parlous state of all Western militaries. The US military is now the smallest it's been for 80 years. It's suffering from major equipment shortages. It's massively overcommitted in multiple theatres. The United States is running out of its ability to sustain support for this war. And the European militaries have got themselves into the same mess. The German military is in a terrible state. The British military is in a terrible state. It seems that the French military isn't in much of a good state either. And as Stephen Bryant has pointed out, the equipment that France has sent to Ukraine, the Caesar howitzers and the AMX-10 RCs, anyway, have not performed well on the Ukrainian battlefields. In fact, we're getting more and more reports that Western equipment in general isn't performing terribly well on the European battlefields. So we have manpower shortages in Ukraine, equipment shortages in the United States and Europe, and with the reluctance of Congress to authorize more funds, and with problems putting together big financial packages in Europe increasing, what do the Americans and the Europeans do? Well, there is a very straightforward answer. They don't negotiate with the Russians. That, of course, as I discussed in my program yesterday, is something that is completely out of the question. They won't even contemplate that possibility. Instead, they're now cannibalizing increasingly on themselves and on their own allies. And they're taking steps which violate fundamental legal principles which have always been acknowledged, but which they now look increasingly likely that they're going to start to breach. So there's now word that the Ukrainian government wants all men of war-fighting age who've left Ukraine and are now in Europe. It wants to conscript them and send them to the war, to fight in the war. It's universally accepted that these men are very unwilling to join the war, and it has also been universally accepted. It is a fundamental principle of Western law that people should not be repatriated to their countries against their will in circumstances where their lives might be placed at risk. And fascinating thing has been to see how Western governments are now looking for ways to breach that fundamental legal principle, a principle that is absolutely sacrosanct, that has never been disputed before or challenged before, that is a core principle in Western human rights law going back centuries. To give one example, I can just remember how in the 1960s and 1970s you used to have lots of young Americans come to Europe and Canada, by the way, to escape the draft, which would have sent them off, packed them off to fight in Vietnam. And there was never any question of European governments or the Canadian government rounding them up and sending them back to the United States so that they could fight in Vietnam. And in fact, had any such thing been attempted, there would have been major legal challenges, and the governments which attempted to do that would have undoubtedly found themselves with very strong, robust court judgments which would have said that this was unacceptable. Well, that was then. Today, things are different. And so far, there's been no decision, no announcement that Western governments will indeed straightforwardly repatriate Ukrainian men to fight in Ukraine. So far, that line has not been crossed, but they are edging gradually towards it. And one thing that I have noticed is that in Germany, for example, where most of these Ukrainian men, or at least a large proportion of them are, there's now suggestions apparently being floated around that any Ukrainian men who refuse to return to Ukraine to fight will be denied benefits. They will have their benefits, assuming they have benefits, they will have their benefits withheld. Well, we'll see whether it happens. I predict it will. Whatever you may think about people, refugees coming to a country and taking benefits there, and I know this is a controversial idea for many people, denying benefits in order to force people to fight in a war is something which would once have been considered unthinkable, but it is now being thought of and apparently being actively discussed. And once again, we see how the rules-based international order, which people like Tony Blinken tells us is founded on human rights law. His particular legal theory, by the way, is that international law of any kind is trumped by human rights law. Human rights law takes precedence over any other international legal provision. Well, that's the argument he's made to the Chinese. I can even remember him having a meeting with, I think it was in Anchorage in Alaska, with the Chinese officials, Wang Yi, making that very point. Anyway, it seems that human rights law the core principle, according to Tony Blinken, of the rules-based international order, well, it turns out that it's actually quite a fungible thing. Anyway, that's one thing that they're now talking about doing. And of course, money. There's no money. Congress is not prepared to authorize more money, and it looks increasingly as if Congress won't authorize more money. And there's resistance in Europe, and I've already explained that the Europeans cannot themselves replace or substitute for the United States. So what do you do instead? You're short of money, but you know you have got $260 billion of frozen Russian assets. Some of them were the former property of the Russian central bank. Some of them apparently private property belonging to various individuals. Well, if you can't get Congress to authorize money, and there isn't money to do it in Europe, well, why not seize this money, which you've frozen, and give it to Ukraine instead? Why not use Russia's money to fight the war against Russia? Now, again, this would once have been thought of as completely unthinkable. Again, one of the fundamental principles of international law is that property belonging to a state carries with it sovereign state immunity. It cannot be seized and used in this way. It can be frozen. Well, actually, even that is controversial, I believe, with some lawyers, but that's been happening quite a lot now. But anyway, but you can freeze it, maybe, but you don't just freeze it, you actually seize it. You grab it and you use it to fund your war against the country that it belongs to. Now, never mind that a couple of years ago, everybody, all legal scholars who know about these things would have united in saying that this was impossible, that this was illegal, that this violated fundamental legal principles of international law and state sovereignty. Never mind that most lawyers, the great majority of international lawyers, are still giving that advice. You can always find some lawyer somewhere who will give you different advice. And if you have 1,000 lawyers who tell you that you can't do something, but you can find one lawyer who tells you that you can, well, go with the one lawyer who tells you that you can. Now, I gather that this idea, which again runs a coach and horses through international law, is actually encountering a great deal of opposition in various countries. And not just in various countries, many of the European countries remain deeply skeptical or indeed opposed to this idea. And there is even today an article in the Financial Times, an editorial in the Financial Times, which was written off the back of a very long article looking at the legal issues, which pretty much said that what is being considered is illegal. But anyway, this editorial also says that this is a line too far, that doing this is not only illegal, but it runs enormous risks with the stability of the international financial system, that countries around the world, China, Saudi Arabia, the other Persian Gulf monarchies, some of the East Asian states, they'll all say to themselves, we can't, in this kind of situation, allow ourselves to have assets, to hold Western assets, to park our money in Western banks and financial institutions. Not only might it be frozen, which, as I said, is legally controversial in itself, but it might even be seized and used against us in all sorts of ways. So Financial Times points to all of that, says this is an extremely bad idea, basically, and don't even think of doing it. But it turns out that there are people in the administration who want to do it, the US administration, who want to do it. And it's not difficult to guess who those people are. I mean, Victoria Nuland, I would have thought, is an obvious case of somebody who does want to do precisely this. I wouldn't be surprised if Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan, geniuses that they are, have also come round to thinking that this would be a great idea. But I suspect that behind it all, there is the personality of the president himself. It needs to be said again that the president on relations with Russia is a extreme hardliner, or so it seems to me, just as he is with policies in the Middle East. And his instinct always is to ignore constraints, legal and otherwise, to reach out and do the most extraordinary things which, as I said, no predecessor president would ever have done in order to achieve, as he thinks, his objective. I would suggest that we can see that in his domestic policies, and it's certainly true in his foreign policies. So there may be a great deal of opposition still to this disastrous plan in Europe, but the president wants it, the administration wants it, sooner or later it will happen. If Congress won't do it, well, why not help ourselves to Russia's own money? So that's another thing that the administration is working towards. But what about weapons? I've already said that there is now a massive shortage of weapons across the West. Every single attempt to try to increase weapons production to match anything like the scale of needs that the Ukrainian war has, well, every such attempt has failed, and there is no likelihood that they will succeed. So what does the administration do? They can't provide Ukraine with more machines, more shells, more tanks, more missiles. So they go to their allies, and they lean on their allies, and they get their allies to give them whatever weapons the allies themselves have. Now, this is not new. Back in the early summer, when it became clear that the European Union would not be able to supply Ukraine with the 1 million shells that it had promised, and when the United States itself found that it no longer had the ability to provide Ukraine with the 1 million shells that Ukraine needed for its great summer offensive, what happened was that the United States went to its ally, South Korea, and it leaned on the South Koreans, and it got the South Koreans to agree to supply 500,000 shells, 500,000 155mm shells. And, of course, these shells were not given to the United States by South Korea. They were loaned by South Korea to the United States, because the supply of shells by South Korea to the United States apparently infringes South Korean policies and perhaps even laws. I'm not an expert on this. And, of course, we were told that these shells were intended to replenish America's own exhausted arsenal of shells. I always thought that they would go straight to Ukraine, and we've now had confirmation in parts of the American media that that is exactly what happened. The Ukrainian offensive of the summer, disastrous as it was enabled by South Korean shells. Well, that was the summer. The United States is now doing the same thing all over again, only this time it's not shells so much, it's air defense missiles. It is short, desperately short of Patriot missile systems. Brian Beletic has discussed at length how the United States doesn't produce that many Patriot missiles in any particular year, that there's already been a global shortage of Patriot missiles, and nonetheless, the United States is committed to supplying Ukraine with more and more Patriot missiles, which it doesn't have, and can't produce in the qualities that are needed. So what does it do? Now it's going to Japan, and it's apparently leaning on the Japanese to try to get the Japanese to supply Patriot missiles to Ukraine. So Patriot missiles from Japan coming on top of shells from South Korea. Of course, Japan and South Korea are, in large measure, as a result of American policy decisions, in what is becoming an increasingly unforgiving and bleak security environment. South Koreans obviously have the long-standing challenge of the enormously powerful adversary to the north. I say enormously powerful. North Korea, after all, does now have a very substantial nuclear weapons arsenal and a missile arsenal, something which South Korea for the moment doesn't have. And of course, there's always been the worry that the situation in the Korean Peninsula could spiral into a war, and the South Koreans in that situation would presumably need all the shells that they had in order to repel the North Koreans. It's also been, over the last few decades, since the end of the Cold War, it's also been South Korean policy to maintain good relations with Russia, in large measure in order to get the Russians to exert leverage on the North Koreans and to deny the North Koreans the advanced military technology that the North Koreans would need if they were to match South Korea in conventional terms. Well, never mind all of that. You lean on the South Koreans, get them to supply the shells. The South Koreans now are 500,000 shells less than they were at the start of this year, which puts them in a more vulnerable position, presumably, with respect to the North. And, of course, the Russians, who know this very well, are angry, and they're distancing themselves from South Korea. And as we've seen, the Russians are now moving closer, ever closer, towards forging, deepening relations with North Korea, and they're going to be supplying North Korea with advanced technologies to assist North Korea in its space program, technologies which, of course, the North Koreans can presumably adapt to build up their conventional missile forces. So, sacrifice again the interests of your South Korean allies in pursuit of your obsession with Ukraine. And Japan, you could argue, is in exactly the same position, because Japan, which as I can remember, about 30, 40 years ago, was working to improve first its relations with China, and then after the end of the Cold War, made a major effort to improve its relations with Russia. The Japanese, for example, made a big effort to try to negotiate with the Russians a peace treaty ending the official state of war that still exists between Russia and Japan following the Second World War. Anyway, all of that now has also been dumped. Japan has been lent on and has instituted successive sanctions against the Russians. The Russians, in response, have informed the Japanese that they're suspending all negotiations about the peace treaty. The Japanese have taken that very badly, but well, it's strange that they should be surprised about this, but now that's what's happened. And in the meantime, Japan, which has been drawn into conflicts in Taiwan and talked into a renewed confrontation with China. Well, Japan, even as it is facing all of this, is now being asked to give up some, who knows how many, of its Patriot air defense missiles, which are, as I've said, relatively few in number, making Japan presumably more vulnerable to missile and air attacks by Russia and China, and, by the way, North Korea as well. So we can see how this obsessive fixation with Ukraine is leading the Western countries, but first and foremost the United States, into places that it once would never have gone. It's violating fundamental legal principles on seizure of assets and on expulsion, effectively, forced expulsion of refugees, returning them to a war zone, which, as I said, if you know anything at all about refugee law, you would know what a fundamental violation that is of conventions going back all the way to the Second World War and even beyond. Anyway, the West, the United States, is now working towards doing all of those things, and it is also systematically weakening the military defenses of its key Asian allies as it focuses, the president persists with his obsession over Russia and Ukraine. And to reiterate again that this is for the president a personal obsession, let me remind everyone that when President Biden returned to the United States in October from his trip to Israel, shortly after the events of 7th October, he gave one of the most disastrous addresses from the Oval Office that any US president has ever made. And the thing that immediately struck me, as I discussed at the time, both on this channel and on the Duran, in this address from the Oval Office, he ended up talking more about Ukraine than about the events in Israel, Gaza, or about what happened on the 7th of October. It is clearly he's an obsession with him. One senses that at some basic level, it's now become a personal contest between him and Vladimir Putin. And he's not going to allow, or so it seems to me, any trivial issues like fundamental principles of refugee law and state sovereignty law, or even the defense capacities of the US's own allies. He's not going to allow any of that to stand in the way of his executing upon this feud. If you want to compare, you want to discuss the level of this obsession, well, I'm not going to say more other than say that Americans, of all people, should understand obsession best and the dangers that it involves, given that the finest literary work on the topic of obsession, Moby Dick, is an American novel. But anyway, that's what we see. Now, it isn't just that the president himself is obsessed and is now, as I said, intent on breaking law by seizing Russian assets, pushing for the repatriation by European states of refugees, helping himself to the weapons of his allies. The United States is now busy doing other things too. It's tightening up the sanctions. As Alex Christoforou and I and any number of people, Eve Smith, for example, at Naked Capitalism, all predicted, the oil price cap, the G7 oil price cap on Russian oil exports, has been a complete and total failure. So what does the president do? What does the administration do? Do they recognize that it has been a complete and total failure and retreat from that policy? Not at all. I was reading the other day in the Financial Times that the United States and Britain are now working on a new scheme to increase the kind of paperwork that ship owners must provide when they're shipping oil, to make sure that they're not shipping Russian oil in breach of the oil price cap. Now, it needs to be stressed that there is nothing illegal about shipping oil above the oil price cap. The oil price cap has no legal force in and of itself. What has happened, however, is that the Americans and the British have tried to limit the number of ship owners who trade in this oil by withholding insurance. And they placed a huge amount, an excessive amount of over-reliance upon the Lloyd's insurance market to police this oil price cap for them. So if you are a Greek ship owner and you tank up with oil in Russia and you deliver this oil to India and you do so taking out your insurance in India or perhaps Russia, but not with Lloyd's, then as far as I can tell, you're not breaking any law. But nonetheless, the United States and Britain are going to now start behaving as if you are. And they're going to start demanding ever more extreme paperwork requirements, and there's going to be all kinds of threats against ship owners, threats which some of these ship owners will disregard, but of course, contrary to what many people in the West appear to believe, the Greek ship owners undoubtedly are playing a big role in this so-called shadow trade in oil, which is a complete misnomer, by the way. It simply means that they're not taking out insurance in London. But anyway, even if the Greeks pull out, there'll be any other number of people, any other number of shipping companies that are happy and able to take their place. The big shipping nations of the world today are not European. They are Asian. India, China above all, and they have no shortage of oil tankers and facilities to transport Russian oil. And by the way, on that issue, the Russians, of course, one of their priorities now, and they've said it, that this should obviously take time to work its way through, is to increase production of ships. They've built enormous shipyards in the Russian Far East, with, by the way, South Korean help. This is before, obviously, this current crisis started. The Russians soon will have the means to build ships themselves, as the Soviet Union once did, by the way. The Soviet Union, as I can remember, at one time had, I think, the largest shipping fleet of any nation using its own flag. But anyway, that's a historic matter. The Russians will be able to do that eventually, but in the meantime, and for the time being, they can still provide and supply oil around the world as they need to, using the ships of various shippers, if not Greeks, then, as I said, Indians or Malays or Chinese or whoever. And the thing to understand about this is that this attempt to not only maintain the oil price cap, but to enforce it, is a red rag to a bull for the major oil producers, not just Russia, but first and foremost Saudi Arabia and the Persian Gulf states as well. Now, about 10 days ago, Glenn Deason and I did a program with Alistair Crook, a person who knows the Middle East extremely well, and he volunteered the opinion, which is an opinion that I have also myself expressed, that the single thing that has turned Saudi Arabia away from its historic close relationship with the United States, the single thing that the Western powers have done, which has most infuriated and antagonized the Saudis and has united them behind MBS in charting a policy towards the BRICS, is this attempt by the president and the administration and the US government to enforce this oil price cap. As far as the Saudis and the Persian Gulf monarchies and the other oil producers are concerned, this is an attempt by a consumer interest, the United States and the G7, to impose prices upon producers. The Saudis, the Persian Gulf monarchies, OPEC Plus, and all the rest. And given that for the Saudis, the oil price is an existential issue, especially now when Saudi Arabia is in the throes of a major investment program to try to recalibrate its economy away from oil, this is an absolutely infuriating thing for the Saudis. And it's extraordinary, again, that the administration either doesn't understand it or refuses to acknowledge it, that instead they are pressing forward with it. Now, Alistair Crook suggested that one of the things that may happen soon is that the Saudis and the other Gulf states might copy what the Russians did in 2014. In 2014, the Russians broke the link of the ruble to the dollar and allowed the ruble to float. And this is a major reform and fundamentally changed Russian economic planning and behavior. And it has its importance, its significance ever since has been underestimated. Anyway, Alistair Crook suggested that the Saudis and the Persian Gulf states are working towards that same goal, that they too are now thinking of ending the link to the dollar of their currencies, and that what they're also seeking to do is that they're talking to the Chinese and the Russians about these two countries providing a backstop for their currencies once the link to the dollar has gone. Now, I am not going to try to analyse in this programme the implications of this. It could be that there are more implications to it than I myself at this moment in time fully understood. But one way or the other, it does seem to me that if this happens, then it will finally and fully confirm that Saudi Arabia and the Persian Gulf monarchies have parted company with the United States, and that this alliance between them and the Americans, which goes back all the way to a meeting between President Roosevelt and the Saudi king, Ibn Saud, back in, I believe it was 1945, that alliance has finally gone. But again, don't worry about that. Focus on trying to enforce an unenforceable and ill-conceived price cap instead, because that is your priority at the moment. And you do the same with your other friends, India. Now, India is a country which the United States has been keen in the last decade or so to win over to its side. I've always myself been skeptical that this would happen. India has always been a champion of non-alignment. It's historically had excellent relations with the Russians. I've never believed for one moment that the Indians would want to sacrifice all of that in return for some kind of alliance with the United States, in which, as they know, they would always be the junior partner. But anyway, that is what the United States has been trying to do. They've been trying to play up the tensions which do exist between India and China in order to try to win over India as an ally for themselves against China. And there's been the so-called Quad that has been created, the United States, Japan, Australia, I believe, and India, which they've tried to build up into some kind of Indo-Pacific alliance against China, and they've worked very, very hard to try to win them over, to win the Indians over as an ally against China. However, the Indians have their own national interests. They've been buying oil from the Russians in ever greater quantities. They've increased their economic relationship with Russia, which is a very long-standing one. It's an historic relationship. It goes back all the way, by the way, to 1953, when the Indian ambassador at large, Krishna Menon, was the last foreign visitor to meet Joseph Stalin in the Kremlin before Stalin's death. And anybody who is familiar with Russian-Indian relations will know how deep and intense the relationship between India and Russia has been, how Khrushchev and Bulganin visited India in the 1950s, how Nehru, the Indian Prime Minister, visited the Soviet Union in the 1950s, how the Soviet Union helped India create its industrial base in the 1960s and re-equipped India's military with advanced Soviet weapons, how the Soviet Union played an absolutely critical role during the 1971 war between India and Pakistan, when the United States was deploying aircraft carriers to the Bay of Bengal, appearing to threaten India. The Soviets countered all of that on India's behalf. This is a very deep, long-standing relationship indeed, and one to which both Russians and Indians are intensely committed. But of course, again, this isn't something that the old man in the White House and the team around him understand or want to understand. And there's been endless pressure on the Indians to change their policy. And over the last few weeks and months, we've had criticisms of the Indian government, of Prime Minister Modi himself, with the United States now joining Canada to make criticisms about Indian security services taking action against Sikh activists in Canada and in the United States, assassinations and that sort of thing. And heavy hints have been dropped by the United States government that Prime Minister Modi himself might be in some way involved with these activities. And the European Union, for its part, has now imposed upon itself an import ban on Russian diamonds. And as I've discussed in previous programs, based on information provided by various people, various members of the community in emails, the diamond trade today is largely dominated by India, and the main focus of that Indian diamond trade is Prime Minister Modi's home state. Well, it's not going to change Prime Minister Modi's policies about that. He's made that absolutely clear. There were some hints that the United States would like to see him go, and there's been some suggestions that they wouldn't be too sorry if the Congress Party were to win the next parliamentary elections. Why they think that would change Indian policy, I have absolutely no idea. The Congress Party in India, historically, has been the party which has been the most keen on good relations with Russia. But anyway, one way or the other, doesn't now look as if it's going to happen. The latest opinion polls and the trends in regional elections in India suggest that next year Prime Minister Modi is going to be re-elected in another landslide. Anyway, the effect of all of this, of all of these manoeuvres and games that are being played, is that Indian-US relations have now soured. Prime Minister Modi wanted to invite President Biden to be the guest of honor at India's National Day celebrations. It now looks like that isn't going to happen. It'll be President Macron of France who will go in President Biden's place. And the meeting that was supposed to happen of the Quad has now been postponed. Obsession is never a healthy thing in any area of life, but it is certainly not a healthy thing in terms of the conduct of policy. We see how the United States and its allies, obsessed with this issue of Ukraine, are steadily losing friends. India being a case in point, Saudi Arabia and the Persian Gulf monarchies being another. They're alienating friends, and they're taking an axe to the very foundational principles of the so-called rules-based international order, which they have always been promoting. They've been telling us that they are the champions of human rights law, and it turns out that when it comes to refugees, they're not. And they've told us that they are the countries where private property rights and state sovereignty are sacrosanct. And that's why people should park their money in Western countries. Only it turns out that they're not that either. Once upon a time, 40, 50 years ago, the United States might have been able to get away with some of these things. After all, if you were a Saudi prince and you wanted to place your money where it would be most secure and where it would gain interest and grow, well, the obvious place to do it, the only place you could do it would be, say, London or Paris or New York. But now, if you're that same Saudi prince, you can do it in Shanghai or Delhi or Bombay or Singapore or Kuala Lumpur or any of all sorts of other places. You don't have to go with the West to anything like the same degree. But anyway, there we go. That is what the Western powers are going to do. None of this is going to change the outcome of the war. Even if all of these reluctant refugees are somehow dragooned back into Ukraine. Even if Russian assets are seized and are given to Ukraine, the money is given to Ukraine. Even if the Japanese cobble together some more Patriot missiles. It cannot change the trajectory of travel on the battlefields. It will prolong the war by a few more months, causing more devastation and death and misery to Ukraine. And the ultimate consequence of that will be an even greater geopolitical disaster for the West when that inevitable Russian victory happens. I'm going to finish today's program by saying that there's been a very interesting article. I didn't say interesting actually, but rather bizarre article in the Financial Times by Simon Cooper. It says, "What if Russia wins?" And then we're given lots of flesh-creeping talk about how the Russians would exact a terrible victor's justice on the Ukrainians, that there might be some sort of precarious Ukrainian state still clinging on in Western Ukraine, about how Putin, always it's Putin, would control close to a quarter of the world's wheat exports, how this would encourage countries like China, Venezuela, Azerbaijan, and indeed Russia itself to commit further aggressions. All of this flesh-creeping stuff. But then, of course, it discusses what surely must be the greatest concern, the greatest worry deep down of all Western that causes Western leaders to fret most. And that is a discredited NATO would face its biggest threat. And it then goes on to say that NATO and the EU, I'm quoting from the article itself now, NATO and the EU are possibly the strongest remaining multinational alliances in a nationalistic world. Putin seeks to prove they won't hold. And then there is a fantastic theory about the Russians attacking the Baltics. It admits that if the Russians did attack the Baltics would be indefendable. NATO would probably send troops, but for how long? Once a few hundred Western soldiers came back dead, far-right parties, why only far-right parties, by the way, would demand peace, meaning unenforceable peace treaties with Putin. Western countries would retreat, saying they had met their obligation under NATO's Article 5, nobody would want to escalate to nuclear war. And the essential thing, the key point, is that NATO would be discredited, the West would be discredited, they would have lost massive face, and nobody would take them seriously again if they lose in Ukraine. And I think, actually, there is more than a grain of truth to this. But who has brought us to this situation? It was the Western powers that insisted on extending NATO eastwards. It was the NATO powers who invited Ukraine to join NATO. It was the Western powers that ignored repeated Russian warnings that NATO membership for Ukraine is unacceptable to Russia and a red line. It was NATO, it was the Western powers who failed to ensure that the Minsk agreement was honoured, and it was the Western powers who forgot Barack Obama's one piece of good and wise advice, that in Ukraine the Russians always possess escalatory dominance. We see the consequences of all that now coming to the fore now, the way in which obsessional policies, because this policy of expanding NATO eastwards was obsessional policies dressed up as policies of principle, have led to calamity, and we can see the price. Well, there we are. That's where I will end today's program. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to go to our shop, where you can find, where we have another sale underway, by the way. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.